"Excuse me, are you sure you're in the right seat?" The words cut through the low hum of the cabin like a blade. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. A young black man sat silently in the wide leather chair of first class, his ticket folded neatly in his hand. He looked up slowly, locking eyes with the passenger standing over him. "This is my seat," he replied, calm but firm. The other man scoffed under his breath, sliding into the row behind him. But the damage was done. The whispers began instantly, weaving through the cabin like smoke. A woman leaned toward her husband and murmured, "He doesn't look like he belongs here." Another voice, sharper, hissed from across the aisle, "First class isn't exactly cheap." The young man straightened his back, staring forward, refusing to flinch. But he felt every word, every sideways glance, pressing against him like invisible weights. Two flight attendants passed by, their smiles faltering when they reached his row. One tilted her head, whispering to the other, "Check the list again." They didn't speak to him, at least not yet, but their hesitation was louder than words. He wasn't just another traveler anymore. He was the subject of suspicion. The tension spread like a quiet storm. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding his gaze, others openly staring. It wasn't turbulence rattling the cabin. It was judgment. And as the whispers swelled into something more, he knew it was only a matter of time before the crew confronted him directly. The humiliation hadn't even begun. "Flight attendant, I think there's been a mistake." The voice rang out from 2 rows back, sharp enough to pierce the uneasy quiet. A man in a business suit leaned into the aisle, pointing, subtly at first, then more directly, toward the young black man seated in first class. The whispers that had lingered like shadows in the previous moments now gathered into a chorus. A woman's voice carried clearly, "He doesn't look like he belongs up here." Another, bolder, added, "I paid good money for this seat. If people can just sneak in, what's the point?" The young man kept his composure, but inside he felt the sting of every word. His ticket lay folded on the tray before him, proof of his place. Yet no proof seemed enough when doubt had already poisoned the air. The murmurs grew louder, confidence building with numbers. It was no longer just speculation, it was accusation. Passengers shifted in their seats, leaning into the aisle to get a better look, their faces painted with suspicion. The pressure soon turned toward the crew. "Aren't you going to check?" someone demanded. Another voice, sharper still, "If you don't ask him, I will." The attendants glanced at each other, uncertainty flashing in their eyes. Their hesitation only fueled the crowd. What had started as whispers now burned like wildfire, spreading from row to row. "Sir, this is unacceptable. Check his ticket. He's probably in the wrong section." The words tumbled one after another, a storm of assumptions, and in the center of it all, the man sat still, shoulders squared, expression calm but unyielding. He refused to shrink even as judgment surrounded him. The crew knew they couldn't ignore it any longer. One attendant finally drew a breath, straightened her posture, and began moving slowly toward him. The cabin hushed for a moment, as if bracing for confrontation. What happened next would decide everything. "Sir, may I see your ticket, please?" The words came coated in politeness, but the undertone was unmistakable. Doubt. The flight attendant stood over him, her practiced smile stiff, her eyes betraying suspicion. The cabin hushed, every passenger leaning in without moving, eager to see what would happen next. The young man lifted his gaze, calm, collected. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, unfolded the ticket, and placed it in her waiting hand. She glanced at it, then at him, and lingered, and lingered. It was there, in her hesitation, the silent suggestion that the paper wasn't enough, that somehow, even in her hands, The proof couldn't possibly be real. "This says, Seat 1A, she murmured, almost questioning the ink itself. "Yes," he replied evenly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing around him. "That's my seat." But she didn't move. She didn't hand it back right away. Instead, she studied him as though waiting for a crack in his confidence. Behind her, the whispers reignited. "See? I told you something was off." "He's bluffing." The tension built like pressure in a sealed cabin, and then another shadow appeared. A second crew member joined her side, clipboard in hand, brows furrowed with concern. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, loud enough for the whole section to hear. The first attendant hesitated. "This gentleman claims he's in the right seat." The man's jaw tightened at that word. Claims. He leaned back, steady but firm. "I don't claim anything. I know this is my seat." The second attendant studied him, then the ticket, then him again. The pause stretched unbearably long. Around them, the atmosphere shifted into a trial by audience, with strangers' eyes serving as judge and jury. "Sir," the second attendant finally said, his tone dripping with disbelief, "can you confirm how you obtained this seat?" The question landed heavy, each word an accusation. It wasn't curiosity, it was doubt, sharpened into something public and humiliating. And just like that, the confrontation was no longer quiet. It was a spectacle, laid bare in front of every watching passenger. The young man held his ground, but inside he knew this wasn't over. The storm was only beginning. "Just admit it. He doesn't belong here." The voice came sharp from across the aisle, and suddenly all the quiet suspicion turned into open accusation. Dozens of eyes locked. On the young man, their stares heavy, suffocating. The wide, plush cabin of first class no longer felt luxurious. It felt like a spotlighted stage. The first attendant still held his ticket, as if unsure whether to hand it back. Her hesitation only emboldened the crowd. A man in a blazer leaned forward. "I've flown this airline for years. People like him don't usually sit in 1A. Gasps rippled, followed by more voices, some condemning, some uneasy. "This is outrageous. He probably snuck up here." "No, leave him alone. He showed his ticket." "Are you really defending this?" The cabin became a courtroom, every passenger serving as judge or jury. Some whispered accusations, others hurled them openly. A few tried to defend him, but their voices were drowned out by the louder, angrier ones. The young man sat straighter, his composure a thin shield against the storm. He wanted to speak, to end the spectacle, but each word that left his mouth seemed only to fuel the fire. "I paid for this seat," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Yeah? With what?" someone jeered. The insult landed like a slap. His chest tightened, his palms pressed against the armrests, but he refused to rise. If he stood, they would see it as aggression. If he stayed quiet, they saw weakness. There was no way to win. The attendants exchanged frantic glances. They had lost control. What began as murmurs had grown into open chaos. The passengers weren't just questioning anymore, they were demanding. "Move him! Prove it again! This isn't right!" Every second stretched, the humiliation pressing heavier, sharper. He wasn't a traveler anymore. He was an intruder in their eyes. A man stripped of dignity, forced to defend what he had already earned. At 30,000 feet, he wasn't soaring. He was being dragged down by prejudice and doubt. And as the confrontation reached its breaking point, the young man knew, soon, something had to give. Because the cabin was seconds away from boiling over. Silence. After the storm of voices, after the accusations and the jeers, the young man sat perfectly still. His back was straight, his eyes forward, his hands resting calmly on the armrests. No anger, no desperation, only composure. The quiet unsettled the cabin more than his words ever could. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, as if expecting him to break, to lash out, to defend himself again. But he didn't. He simply waited. The crew, however, grew restless. The first attendant shifted from foot to foot, tickets still trembling slightly in her hand. The second leaned in closer, his voice tight. "Sir, if you'd just explain, this would be easier for everyone." The young man finally turned his head, his expression unreadable. "I don't need to explain what I've already proven." The words landed heavy, almost defiant in their calmness. The attendant faltered, caught off guard by the certainty in his tone. Around them, whispers reignited, passengers torn between suspicion and curiosity. Why wasn't he fighting? Why wasn't he crumbling? The silence stretched again, becoming unbearable. The attendants flipped through their manifest, checking and rechecking, as though desperate to uncover some mistake. But every second that passed only made them appear less sure, while he grew more unshakable. One passenger muttered, "Why is he so calm? What's he hiding?" Another whispered, Maybe he really does belong here." And still, he waited. What no one knew was that he carried something none of them could imagine. Proof not just of his seat, but of his authority. He didn't need to argue. He didn't need to shout. Because the moment he chose to reveal it, everything would change. The storm wasn't over. It was only gathering for the strike. Enough! The single word wasn't loud, but it carried more weight than all the accusations combined. The young man finally shifted, reaching C, warmly into his jacket. The attendants froze, passengers leaned forward, and for a breathless moment the entire cabin seemed suspended in silence. He withdrew a slim leather case, flicked it open, and laid it flat on the tray before him. The gold-embossed emblem gleamed under the cabin lights, crisp against the dark leather. Inside was a government credential, undeniable, unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the aisle. One passenger whispered, "Is that—" Another stammered, "Oh my God, he's with the government." The lead attendant bent closer, her face draining of color as her eyes scanned the document. Her hands trembled slightly when she handed it back. I apologize, sir. I wasn't aware." The young man met her gaze, his voice steady and unshaken. "You didn't need to be aware. You only needed to trust the proof I already gave you." Behind her, the second attendant straightened abruptly, his tone shifting from suspicion to forced courtesy. "Sir, of course. Please, let us make this right. Is there anything we can bring you? A drink, perhaps?" But their sudden kindness only made the ugliness of the moment sharper. The very passengers who moments ago doubted him now averted their eyes, some shifting uncomfortably, others fumbling for apologies. A businessman cleared his throat. I didn't realize." "You didn't need to realize," the man cut in, his words measured but cutting. "Respect should not depend on a title." The cabin was silent now, not with judgment, but with shame. The confrontation had ended in an instant, but its sting lingered, hanging over every person who had doubted him. He leaned back in his seat, credentials tucked away once more, composure unbroken. What had been humiliation only moments ago had turned into revelation. The balance of power had shifted, not because he had changed, but because the truth had finally been forced into the op. And as the attendants scrambled to restore order, the young man knew this flight would land, but the lesson in this cabin was far from over. The moment his credentials closed with a soft snap, the silence in the cabin became deafening. The tension that once condemned him now twisted into something else. Embarrassment. Passengers shifted in their seats, eyes darting anywhere but toward him. A man who had mocked him earlier sank lower, pretending to fiddle with his seatbelt. A woman who had whispered harshly to her husband now bowed her head, her cheeks flushed with shame. But the crew, Oh, the crew, transformed in an instant. The same attendants who had doubted, questioned, and lingered too long now scrambled to outdo one another in courtesy. One leaned in with a strained smile. "Sir, can I offer you a warm towel? Perhaps a glass of champagne?" Another chimed in, "Please, let us know if there's anything we can do to make you more comfortable." Their exaggerated politeness wasn't kindness. It was damage control, a desperate attempt to erase the scene that had already burned itself into every witness's memory. The young man said nothing. His silence was louder than their apologies. He adjusted slightly in his seat, his presence commanding without effort, his calmness a mirror that reflected their guilt back at them. Beyond first class, the ripples spread. Even passengers in economy craned their necks, catching fragments of whispered rumors. "Did you hear? He's government. They tried to throw him out of first class. And now look at them, treating him like royalty." The irony was suffocating. Respect, denied so quickly at first, was now offered in excess, not because they recognized his humanity, but because they feared his authority. The young man looked around, taking in their discomfort. For him, it wasn't victory. It was a reminder of how fragile their courtesy had been all along. And as the attendants hovered anxiously, the question lingered in the air. Would they have ever treated him as equal, if not for the power he carried? The answer hung heavy, leading into a truth he could no longer ignore. Respect filled the cabin now, but it felt hollow. The young man sat in silence, watching the sudden shift in every face around him. Moments ago they doubted him, whispered against him, even mocked him. Now they avoided his gaze or offered timid smiles, desperate to rewrite what they had just done. He leaned back in his seat, thoughts heavy. So this is what it takes. A laminated card, a title, proof that he carried power greater than theirs, not respect for his character, not trust in his word, but deference born out of fear. The attendants hovered nervously, their courtesy dripping with insincerity. "Anything else you need, sir?" "We'll make sure you're comfortable." Their voices wavered, their politeness exaggerated, their guilt barely concealed. He shook his head gently. "You didn't see me. You only saw what you wanted to believe." It was bittersweet. He had silenced their doubts, but not with his humanity, with credentials. And that realization stung more deeply than the insults ever had. Passengers shifted uneasily, unable to escape the truth of his words. Some bowed their heads, others stared fixedly at the floor. The shame hung in the air, impossible to ignore. The man knew then this was not justice. It was compliance, a respect forced, not earned. And as the plane continued slicing through the night sky, he understood. This lesson wasn't his to carry. It was theirs. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, but the silence inside the cabin was louder than the roar of the engines. Passengers gathered their belongings quietly, sneaking glances toward the young man who had endured it all. He rose slowly, his movement steady, his dignity intact. The attendants rushed to his side, their smiles forced, their apologies fumbling. "Thank you for flying with us, sir. We truly hope to see you again." But he offered only a polite nod, nothing more. Their sudden courtesy meant little now. It was too late. As he stepped into the aisle, the passengers who had judged him shrank in their seats. Some lowered their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably, unable to face the weight of their own prejudice. The cabin that once buzzed with whispers was now frozen in silence. Walking toward the exit, he carried no anger, only clarity. Respect that must be proven isn't respect at all. The door opened, the sunlight pouring in. He left the plane with his head high, leaving behind not just a cabin of stunned passengers, but a lesson none of them would forget. Because true dignity should never rest on wealth, race, or status, only on our shared humanity.